quiet corner of Windsor Great Park. Tourists walk past it every year without ever knowing what lies beneath the ground. In the autumn of 2010, a hole had already been dug there, weeks before anyone died. Not by an intruder, not by a stranger, by a British Airways pilot, a man trusted with hundreds of lives at 35,000 feet, who had quietly prepared a grave for his wife before he had even decided, in his own words, to kill her. 1 week. That is how close Joanna Simpson came to freedom. 1 week before her divorce would have been finalised, her estranged husband picked up a hammer, hid it in their daughter's school bag, and waited for her to bring their children home. What happened next would end with her body buried in a park millions of people walk through every year, and with a legal verdict that would divide a nation over what actually counts as murder. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Joanna Simpson was 46 years old, and by every account from the people who loved her, she was someone who filled a room the moment she walked into it. She was born in York, the daughter of a successful builder, and grew up attending York College for Girls before her family later moved to the Isle of Man following the sale of her father's construction business. That upbringing gave Joanna a foundation of financial independence and confidence that would follow her into adulthood. She went on to build her own career as a businesswoman, eventually settling with her husband in Ascot, in an area of Berkshire so affluent it was informally nicknamed Millionaire's Row, bordered by the wide, ancient woodland of Windsor Great Park. To her closest friends, Joanna was warm, vivacious, and fiercely protective of her 2 children. Her best friend, Hetty Barkworth Nanton, would later describe her as exactly the kind of person who filled a room with life, someone impossible to forget once you had met her. Other friends who came forward during the trial painted a consistent picture, describing a woman who had spent years quietly documenting and confiding in people around her about the escalating tension inside her marriage, precisely because she sensed how serious it might become. Joanna had built her life carefully, financially independent, socially confident, and devoted to her children's routines. She represented, on paper, exactly the kind of stability her Ascot postcode suggested. That image mattered because it made it easier for the people around her, and later for a jury, to underestimate just how frightened she genuinely was behind closed doors. But behind the comfortable house and the private school routine, Joanna had spent years living with a fear she rarely spoke about publicly. She was frightened enough of her own husband that she made sure never to be alone with him during the handovers of their children. On the day that fear finally caught up with her, the one arrangement that had always kept her safe was, for the first time in a long while, not in place. Robert Brown was a British Airways pilot, a career built on precision, discipline, and public trust. Passengers boarding his flights had no reason to imagine the man in the cockpit was capable of anything but professionalism. At home, a very different picture had been forming for years. The marriage between Robert and Joanna began to unravel around 2007, when Brown accused Joanna of having an affair. That same year, during a phone call made from Hong Kong while away on a work trip, Brown told Joanna he had been having what he described as dark thoughts, including thoughts of killing her and their children with an axe, and of ending his own life by crashing an aircraft. Not long after that call, back at their home, Brown confronted Joanna in the kitchen after learning she had spent time with a man he suspected her of having an affair with. He put his arm around her neck and held a knife against her chest. From that point on, Joanna made a quiet but deliberate decision. Whenever Brown returned the children to her after a visit, she made sure another person was present. It was not paranoia, it was a safety plan, built from direct experience of what her husband was capable of when he felt he was losing control. The divorce process that followed was long and bitter, dragging on for roughly 3.5 years. Brown would later claim he felt cheated by the terms of a prenuptial agreement and by the financial settlement he believed he was entitled to. Whatever the truth of those grievances, one fact remained unchanged. The man Joanna had built a life with had already told her, years earlier, exactly what thoughts were running through his mind when he felt cornered. By October 2010, the divorce between Robert and Joanna was only 1 week away from being finalised. For most separating couples, that final stretch represents the light at the end of a long and difficult process. For Joanna, it should have meant the beginning of a life fully separated from a man she had already learned to fear. What the outside world did not know was that Brown had, at some point before the 31st of October, travelled to a secluded area of Windsor Great Park and dug a shallow grave. He would later tell psychiatrists this was intended as a kind of time capsule, a place to bury paperwork from the divorce and, in his words, the sham of his marriage. No matter how that explanation is read, the fact remains that a hole large enough for a body existed in the ground before anyone had died. On the morning of Sunday the 31st of October, Brown collected a claw hammer from the bike shed at his property. He placed it inside his daughter's homework bag, the same bag she would be carrying home with her that day. That afternoon, Brown brought the 2 children back to Joanna's house after a period of contact time. On any other handover, a friend would likely have been present, exactly as Joanna had planned for years. On this occasion, no one else was there. There is no public record explaining why that particular safeguard was missing on that particular afternoon. It may have been a simple scheduling gap, the kind of small, ordinary logistical failure that happens in any long-running custody arrangement. Whatever the reason, it meant that the one precaution Joanna had relied on for years, the presence of a witness, was absent at the exact moment it mattered most. As the children ran ahead into the house, Robert and Joanna were left standing together at the front door. An argument broke out between them. During that argument, Brown reached into his daughter's bag, took out the hammer he had hidden there earlier that day, and struck Joanna with it 14 times. The attack was witnessed in part by their younger child. Joanna's body later showed clear signs that she had tried to defend herself, with injuries to her hands and arms consistent with raising them to protect her head. Any single one of the blows delivered that day could, on its own, have been fatal. After the attack, Brown carried Joanna's body to the boot of his car. He went into the master bedroom and removed the house's CCTV recording unit from a cupboard. He then put the children into the car, drove them to the home of his girlfriend, who was pregnant at the time, and switched off his mobile phone. From there, Brown drove to the area of Windsor Great Park, where the grave had already been dug. He buried Joanna's body inside a plastic garden storage box, along with the CCTV unit and the hammer. In the days that followed, Brown told police his wife was missing. As the investigation intensified and a search operation involving around 100 officers got underway, he changed his account, describing a physical altercation in which he claimed to have pushed her before attempting to take her to hospital. It was only after several days of questioning that Brown led officers to the exact location in the park, where Joanna's body was finally recovered from the ground on the 5th of November 2010. The forensic picture in this case did two things at once. It confirmed how Joanna died, and it exposed the extent of planning behind her death. The post-mortem examination, carried out at Wexham Park Hospital, established that Joanna had been struck with a claw hammer using what pathologists described as heavy force, with at least 14 separate impacts to her head. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated she had tried, in her final moments, to shield herself from the blows. Investigators also had to reconstruct the sequence of events after the attack, piecing together how Brown had disposed of both the body and the physical evidence connected to it. The removal of the CCTV unit from the house was significant, since it suggested a deliberate attempt to eliminate any recorded footage from that day. The pre-dug grave in Windsor Great Park was equally significant for a different reason. Under English law, planning and preparation ahead of a killing is one of the clearest indicators a court can weigh when determining intent, and the existence of a grave dug in advance became a central point of dispute at trial. At Ridding Crown Court, the defense introduced psychiatric evidence diagnosing Brown with a stress-related adjustment disorder attributed to the pressures of the divorce. The jury was told that such a condition could, in rare circumstances, impair a person's ability to control violent impulses. That psychiatric evidence became the decisive factor in the case, ultimately persuading a majority of jurors, 10 out of 12, that Brown should be found not guilty of murder and instead guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The prosecution had argued the opposite interpretation of the same facts. Prosecutors pointed to the pre-dug grave, the concealed hammer, and the removal of the CCTV unit as evidence of clear planning rather than a sudden loss of control. Under the standard legal test for diminished responsibility, a defendant must show that an abnormality of mental functioning substantially impaired their ability to understand their conduct, form a rational judgment, or exercise self-control. The jury's narrow majority verdict, 10 in favour to 2 against, shows just how finely balanced that assessment was, even with all of the physical evidence laid out before them. To be clear from the outset, nothing here is a clinical diagnosis of Robert Brown as an individual. It is a look at the pattern of behaviour that was presented in court and later examined by journalists, campaigners, and the parole board itself. The phone call Brown made from Hong Kong in 2007, describing thoughts of killing Joanna and their children before ending his own life, is often pointed to by those who reviewed this case as an early and specific warning sign made more than 3 years before the killing itself. Combined with the earlier incident in which he held a knife to Joanna's chest, a pattern emerges of a man who, when he felt his control over the relationship slipping, responded with thoughts and acts of extreme violence rather than any attempt to seek help. The digging of the grave weeks in advance sits uneasily alongside the diminished responsibility defense that was ultimately accepted in court. Preparing a burial site is not typically consistent with a single, uncontrolled loss of temper. It suggests, at minimum, that some part of what would happen on the 31st of October had already been anticipated, even if Brown's precise state of mind at the moment of the attack remains genuinely disputed. Since his sentencing, Brown's own account of the marriage has shifted. In later parole assessments, he is described feeling manipulated by Joanna during the divorce and pressured by the terms of their prenuptial agreement. Reviewers examining the case have noted that no records from the period of the marriage itself, whether from police, doctors, or people who knew the couple, support that version of events. What the contemporaneous evidence does show is a woman who had organized her life around avoiding being alone with her husband years before he killed her. This case carries a controversy that has not faded with time, and it centers on a single uncomfortable question. How does a man plan a grave in advance, strike his wife 14 times with a hammer in front of one of their children, then calmly remove security footage and drive his children to his girlfriend's house, and still walk away with a manslaughter conviction rather than a murder conviction? The trial judge, Mr. Justice Cook, did not shy away from this tension. Even while sentencing Brown for manslaughter, he stated plainly that Brown had intended to kill his wife and had intended to conceal her body and hide the evidence of the killing. That is an extraordinary thing for a judge to say about a defendant convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, and it captures exactly why Joanna's family described the verdict as, in their words, a miscarriage of justice. That controversy did not end with sentencing. It resurfaced years later, in 2023, when Brown became eligible for automatic release after serving half of his 26-year sentence, with no parole hearing and no mental health reassessment required by law. Joanna's mother, Diana Parks, and her close friend Hetty Barkworth Nanton launched a public campaign to stop that release, ultimately persuading the Justice Secretary to use new legal powers to block it and refer the case to the Parole Board instead. Brown challenged that decision in the High Court and lost. This case has since become a reference point in wider conversations across England about how the justice system sentences domestic homicide and about whether a psychiatric defense should be enough to separate a case like this one from a murder conviction. That wider conversation has a name. Following campaigns from families in cases similar to this one, an independent review of how English courts sentence domestic homicide was commissioned, led by barrister Claire Wade. That review examined a pattern seen across many such cases, where killings within a relationship involving overkill, prior threats, or controlling behavior have historically received lighter sentences than killings involving strangers. Joanna's case is frequently cited in that broader debate, precisely because a judge who accepted the jury's manslaughter verdict still stated, on the record, that Brown had intended to kill her and to conceal what he had done. In May 2011, Robert Brown was sentenced to a total of 26 years in prison, 24 years for manslaughter, and a further 2 years for obstructing a coroner in the execution of their duty. For more than a decade afterwards, Joanna's family continued fighting simply to ensure he would not walk free before that sentence was properly examined. That fight reached its latest chapter in May 2026, when the Parole Board ruled that Brown had done no meaningful risk reduction work during his time in custody and refused to accept that he posed any danger to the public. He remains in prison. Diana Parks said she was incredibly relieved by that decision and remembered her daughter as the beautiful, vivacious woman she was at 46. A description that has stayed constant through 16 years of court hearings, appeals, and headlines. It is worth returning to where this story started, a hole in the ground dug weeks before anyone in Joanna's life knew it existed, in a park that families walk through every single day without a second thought. That quiet, ordinary setting is what makes this case so difficult to shake. The danger here was never hidden in a stranger or in a dark alley. It was hidden inside a marriage, inside a divorce, inside a man whose job was to be trusted with hundreds of lives at once. Joanna Simpson spent years trying to protect herself and her children from a threat she could see clearly, long before anyone else was willing to believe her. Her story, and her family's 16-year fight for accountability, deserve to be remembered exactly as she was, not as a case number, but as a mother, a friend, and a woman who was let down by the one person who was supposed to protect her. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through. Cases like Joanna's are difficult to sit with, and I'm genuinely grateful to every one of you who takes the time to listen to these stories with care rather than looking away. If this video meant something to you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and I will see you there.